has come with a presentation that I'd love for you all to hear on the history behind antitrust and the case. So, Paul, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and take it from there.
Thank you, Matt, for inviting Bob and I to this platform along with Lee. And we have the pleasure of representing a bunch of newspapers and publishers in the antitrust case against Google. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of give you a big, broad overview of what this case is, why we brought it, what its purpose is, and then to answer any of your questions. And so we'll start with, this is my journalism from a high school journalism, the 5 questions to ask. So I'm going to attempt to identify the who, what, when, where, and why of what we're doing. All right. So this is who. The first case that we filed was on behalf of the Charleston Gazette-Mail. And that's who what Lee's doing for a living these days is he's running this esteemed newspaper. The reason I bring this up is because the background between Bob and myself and this newspaper really dates back to the headlines that you read here. And I don't want to get into a long, boring story, but it's important for context when we tell these stories. The Sunday Gazette-Mail broke this story in December of 2016. And it was based upon the Arcos data of opioid pills sold into West Virginia. I read this newspaper, Lee, at my father's breakfast table on Sunday morning. And my mother asked me what I was going to do about it. Arising out of this newspaper headline, I filed the first opioid cases in the country, which led to the national opioid litigation that I have been appointed co-lead for. And in fact, Bob Fitzsimmons and I tried the first and only opioid case in Charleston, West Virginia last summer, and we're waiting on the verdict. You'll probably read in newspapers around the country on Friday that there's a national $26 billion settlement in the works. Nonetheless, this local newspaper broke this story and won a Pulitzer Prize for it in 2017. Now let's freeze frame that for a second and let's back up and provide a little more context. In 2005 and 2006, there were 2 newspapers in Charleston, West Virginia. One with an editorial page that leaned left and one with an editorial page that leaned right. But something happened in the late 2000s that really began to impact the bottom line, and the advertising dollars began to shrink. And these 2 newspapers entered into a joint operating agreement to try to share overhead and expenses of publication to survive. And guess what happened? The federal government came in and filed an antitrust suit, broke up the joint operating agreement, and forced both papers into bankruptcy. Some irony in all this story that will come around. This is the first complaint you're seeing on behalf of a newspaper in the United States joining the antitrust litigation. You can see it was filed January 29th, 2021 in federal court in the Southern District of West Virginia against Google and Facebook. Since that time, this has been the rallying flag for newspapers and publishers across the country. Bob will talk about that a little bit more in a bit. These are the 4 law firms that I have hand-selected to build this team. Between my firm, Bob Fitzsimmons, and then the Robbins Geller and Herman Jones firm, this represents, in my opinion, the dream team, the pinnacle of legal representation for antitrust and trial work in the United States. So now a little history. To understand the Sherman, John Sherman was this guy from Ohio, and I found this cartoon at the bottom of the thing. This is a political cartoon from the late 1880s. And essentially what happened is this, is that after the Civil War, when Reconstruction was beginning, the country found out that most business industries were held by very few hands. And as you can see from it, the legislature is trying to deal with the steel beam trust or the copper trust. All of the resources were concentrated in a particular industry sector in one person's hands. And that wasn't very good for business. So let's just take the game of Monopoly, right? Everybody has played Monopoly. And if you'll remember, in Monopoly, what we do is we all start out on even grounds. The bank gives us all an even amount of money. The definition of monopoly in the Sherman Act is real simple. It's simply put into the original rules of monopoly published in 1935. The object of the game Monopoly is for everybody to start off with such good advantage. And then the end of the game is when one person forces all of the other players out of the game. A player who goes bankrupt must pick up his piece and go home. That's what monopolies are, is that when you win the game of Monopoly, one person has all the property and money, everybody else goes home. And so then what do? The game is over and you start again. That's what happened in 1911 with Standard Oil. Standard Oil is the first case the United States Supreme Court considered antitrust. And it's very simple. Did Standard Oil hold a monopoly? And if so, they're going to break it apart. This is the expansion and consolidation of marketplaces in the United States. Standard Oil initially was broken up into several subparts, and then those subparts began to merge back. Eventually, what you'll see is a concentration again as the game of Monopoly proceeds and other players go bankrupt and leave until we start all over. You'll see the same thing with AT&T. When it was broken up in 1984, you'll see that there were a whole bunch of other people that started out on even playing grounds until the game proceeded. And now what we're seeing is, again, a concentration of the market. So the reason that we started this process is really triggered by the congressional investigation. In October of 2020, there was a 400-page report published by Congress who spent months and months and months studying digital advertising monopoly. And when you look at the report, it announces that Facebook and Google have unassailable positions, that there are no alternative places. These two companies have dominated digital advertising to a greater extent than Standard Oil and a greater extent than Ma Bell. When you look at the testimony of it, you see the News Media Alliance has had a very active role. And when you look at the table of contents from this congressional hearing, there is one particular class that has been impacted of note in this report, and that is the free and diverse press. There are some 15 pages of congressional testimony and findings about the impact of Google and Facebook's monopoly on newspapers. As a result, the US federal government and 48 attorney generals have all instituted antitrust actions against Google and Facebook. The main purpose of this, of Section 1 of the Sherman Act, is to identify whether or not there's a restraint of trade. So by way of example, I want everybody to think about this. If you wanted to buy Google stock, you wouldn't call Google. If Google wanted to sell you stock, they wouldn't call you. You would go through a broker, and Google would go through a broker, and you would meet in the electronic marketplace called the New York Stock Exchange. The same thing happens now in digital advertising. When I was in high school, I would go to the local hot dog stand and say, "Do you want to run an advertisement in my school newspaper?" And then they would give me a markup and I would put it in the paper. That's not how it works anymore. The way it works now is that if you want advertising in your newspaper, you have to go to a digital broker. If someone wants to place advertising, they have to go through a broker. Both of those brokers are run by Google. Those two brokers will meet in the middle in an ad exchange. The ad exchange is run by Google. So what's happening is that we have advertisers and we have publishers, and they have Google agents and brokers that are meeting in Google's playground and playing by Google's rules. That in and of itself is a restraint of trade that will likely result in the antitrust action breaking up Google's digital monopoly. It gets even better though. What happened is that just like the NASDAQ competes with the New York Stock Exchange, Facebook fell behind Google. And Facebook decided to open up their own ad exchange to compete with Google's playground. Well, Google didn't want the competition. So Google went to Facebook and they cut a deal. This would be like the New York Stock Exchange going to NASDAQ when the NASDAQ was just starting and saying, look, if you'll forego competing with us, we will cut you a sweetheart deal to make you a priority for digital advertising over everybody except Google. And they were so arrogant as to call internally this agreement in writing Jedi Blue. So we now have the documents of Jedi Blue. And for those of you that don't know, this is a blue Jedi. Jedi Blue contract actually adds 2 pages of what Google and Facebook agree to do together if they ever get sued by antitrust. Now, why? This is from the congressional report. This is new newspaper advertised spending from 2000 to 2022 in dollars spent. This is the trend that everybody began seeing in 2006, 7, 8, 9. This is the transition point. This is Bill Gates's the internet tidal wave. This is the effect of the consolidation of the market. This is the page circulation of daily newspapers in the United States from 85 to 2018. While there have been cyclical trends in the United States over time, there has never been such a drop in circulation in the history of newspapers in our country. This is from the University of North Carolina School of Journalism. If any of you haven't seen this report, they've been monitoring the decline of local newspapers across the country in an interactive map called a news desert. As you can see, not only are there places with no newspapers, you'll see the massive increase in the yellow territory where now there's only one newspaper served. This is Facebook's global revenue as of 2020. It is inverse to the experience of the newspapers. And this is Google's advertising revenue. From 03 to 2019, it's now $174 billion. So while each of the newspapers have attempted to transition from print to digital, and as their online subscriptions went up, their revenue went down. And that's because nobody can compete with Google for the digital dollars. So what we're asking for in this lawsuit, the Sherman Antitrust Act says that if you have a monopoly or you attempt to enter into an agreement with another competitor to monopolize, the harm that is suffered by those like the newspapers and publishers is the difference between where we should have been and where we are. And then we get what's called treble damages, where you take your economic losses, you multiply them by 3, and on top of that, you have to pay their lawyers as well. So what that means in general is this, is that the law firms that I have brought together are willing to underwrite the risk. We have the manpower and the means to prosecute the case. If we lose, you owe us nothing. If we win, the bad guys pay your lawyer bills. Now, aside from all of that, there is something even greater that we're pursuing. If you think about the aftermath of what happened with Standard Oil, think about the aftermath of what happened when Ma Bell gets broken. The marketplace is being reset in both of those industries. If by chance the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, the Attorney Generals, us, if we prevail, we will then have an opportunity to reset the marketplace for digital newspapers. We're not interested in doing what Australia did or what the European Union is attempting, which is to simply have them throw scraps from the table to allow the newspaper industry to survive. What we're looking for is to take Google News away from Google, to take the aggregators away from Apple, take it away from Microsoft, and to create our own self-sufficient standing digital newspaper stand that we control, that the advertising dollars goes to us, that we define the marketplace for ideas moving forward. And if we do that, when we do that, the newspapers won't just be able to survive in today's economy. They'll once again begin to thrive. And what we can see is a true free and diverse press in communities across the country. Because without local newspapers, the opioid epidemic would have raged on for at least another decade before anybody figured out what was going on. So I am a firm believer in not only trying to recoup the past, but build a future moving forward. And those that have joined our cause will have a seat at the table when we redefine the marketplace. So in general, that's my pitch. That's the update.
Wow. Fantastic overview. Thank you so much, Paul. That was incredibly enlightening. I want to just, first of all, make sure everyone knows that we're taking questions throughout this. So please locate the chat box or the Q&A, and please start putting any questions you have in there.